started like so many chilling tales do, quietly. No screams, no alarms, just an ordinary man, living what looked like an ordinary life. But behind Andrew Urdialis' calm smile, behind the quiet streets he walked every day, lurked a darkness so cold, so calculated. It would take years to bring it into the light, and when it finally did, the truth would leave seasoned detectives speechless, families shattered, and a nation asking how this man, this monster, hid in plain sight for so long. Because this isn't just another true crime story. This is the story of the serial killer next door. A story that begins with a single, forgotten gun, and ends with a twist so shocking, you will not see it coming. So stay with me for the full story. And before we dive in, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe so you don't miss the darkest true crime cases you've never heard before. Because this one is going to haunt you. It started like so many stories do, quietly. No screams, no alarms, just an ordinary man, living what seemed like an ordinary life. But behind Andrew Urdialis' calm smile and unassuming presence, lurked a darkness so deep, it would take years to bring it into the light. And when it finally did, the truth would leave seasoned detectives speechless, families shattered, and a nation wondering how this monster walked among us for so long, undetected. This is the story of Andrew Urdialis, a man with two lives, the one everyone saw, and the one no one could have imagined. Back in the early 1990s, in the quiet suburbs of Illinois, police were used to routine calls. Drunk drivers, domestic disputes, a stolen car here and there. But one call, one seemingly ordinary police call, would spark a chain of events that would unravel one of the most disturbing serial killer cases in modern history. At the time, nobody knew that this call would eventually expose a man who had taken the lives of at least 8 women. The irony? This break in the case didn't start with a body. It didn't start with a missing persons report. It started with a gun. A gun that was supposed to be destroyed. Back then, when evidence was no longer needed, when guns were confiscated, they were melted down, erased from existence. But this one somehow slipped through the cracks. And because it did, detectives now had in their hands the one piece of evidence that would begin to unravel Andrew Urdialis' double life. They didn't know it yet, but this weapon would eventually connect him to unsolved murders stretching from the Midwest all the way to California. Imagine it. You're a detective holding a weapon you thought was just part of a standard case file. But the ballistics, the records, something doesn't add up. And when you run the tests, your blood runs cold. Because the bullets from this very gun match not one, not two, but multiple unsolved homicides. And that's when detectives realized they weren't just dealing with a criminal. They were dealing with a killer, a serial killer. But here's the thing about Andrew Urdialis. He was careful, calculated. He didn't leave easy clues behind. He blended in, worked ordinary jobs, paid his bills on time. The guy you might nod to at the gas station, never knowing the evil standing just feet away. The murders stretched across years. The victims? Women. Vulnerable. Alone. Some were picked up near military bases in California. Others in Illinois. He crossed state lines, changed methods, made sure there was no obvious pattern. It was as if he thought he was untouchable. And for years he was. But what Urdialis didn't count on was survival. Because in 1992, one woman fought back. She was supposed to be another name on his list. Another victim who would vanish into the shadows of his growing body count. But she didn't. She lived. And her story would become the single most powerful weapon against him. Detectives met her in a small interview room. She was shaking, voice trembling, but she told them everything. The ride, the threats, the moment she realized this man planned to kill her, and the terrifying fight for her life that ended with her escaping into the night. And when she saw his photo years later, after the murders in California made headlines, she froze. It was him, the same man, the same eyes. The man who had tried to kill her had gone on to kill again. By the mid-90s, investigators from multiple states began connecting dots. The gun, the surviving victim's testimony, the matching ballistics on unsolved murders across Illinois and California. And the more they dug, the more horrifying it became. Because Andrew Urdialis wasn't denying anything. Not when they finally brought him in. Not when they showed him the evidence. In fact, he admitted it all. Every single one. 8 women. Their lives stolen. And now he was calmly telling detectives how he did it. Like someone describing a weekend fishing trip. No remorse. No hesitation. Just cold, horrifying detail. But this story, it doesn't end with a simple confession. Because even with his words, even with the survivor's testimony, the legal battle was just beginning. And nobody, not the detectives, not the families, not even the prosecutors, could have predicted the shocking twists still to come. The survivor who escaped, she thought facing him in court would be the end. Justice served. But Andrew Urdialis had one more surprise waiting. One final, devastating twist that nobody could have seen coming. The day Andrew Urdialis walked into the courtroom, everything felt heavy. The air, the silence, the eyes of victims' families locked on the man who had taken so much from them. He sat there, hands folded, calm, as if this wasn't about 8 innocent lives. As if this wasn't about the fear, the screams, the nights of terror only he knew the full truth about. And maybe that's what made it so chilling. Andrew Urdialis didn't look like the monsters you see in movies. No wild eyes, no angry outbursts. He was polite, soft-spoken, unnervingly ordinary, the kind of man who could sit next to you on a bus. And you'd never suspect a thing. The prosecutors laid out the case piece by piece. The gun, the one that was supposed to be destroyed. The survivor, the woman whose courage had brought the case to life. The ballistics tying him to murder after murder. The confessions, his own words describing how he stalked, hunted, and killed. But Urdialis had a defense team, and they weren't about to let this case be simple. They questioned evidence, timeline gaps, jurisdiction confusion between Illinois and California. They even pushed claims about his mental health, trying to plant seeds of doubt. Because in death penalty cases, doubt is everything. And here's where the tension in the courtroom skyrocketed. When the survivor, the woman who had escaped Urdialis years earlier, took the stand. She was older now, stronger, but as she began recounting what happened, you could hear the crack in her voice, the fear she still carried, the memory of that night when she realized this stranger wanted her dead. She described the car ride, the way he smiled at first, how it all shifted when his words grew darker, the sudden stop on a deserted road, the gun, the fight for her life, the moment she broke free and ran into the night, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. And then she turned, pointed at Andrew Urdialis, and said the words everyone in that courtroom would never forget. It was him. He's the one who tried to kill me. The room fell silent. Urdialis didn't flinch. Not when she told the jury how terrified she was. Not when she said she still had nightmares. Not when she begged them to make sure no one else suffered the way she had. But even with her testimony, even with his confession, the legal battle dragged on. Because Urdialis had committed murders in multiple states, different jurisdictions, different laws, and while California prosecutors pushed for the death penalty, Illinois had abolished it. So what do you do with a man who killed in 2 different states, with 2 very different justice systems? The legal teams clashed over where he should be tried first, which victims' families should hear verdicts first, who should have to sit through testimony describing the horrors he carried out, again and again. Months passed. Families sat through graphic details. Survivors relived their worst nightmares on the witness stand. Jurors listened to evidence that made them physically sick. And Urdialis? He just sat there, like none of it mattered, like he was watching someone else's story. Then came the day everyone had been waiting for. The verdict. The jury filed in, eyes red, faces pale. They had seen the photos, heard the confessions, listened to every horrifying detail, and they said the words the families had prayed for. Guilty, on all counts. California sentenced him to death. Illinois, life in prison. Justice, it seemed, had finally arrived. Families cried. The survivor hugged prosecutors. Reporters rushed to file their stories about the serial killer next door, finally being brought down. But Andrew Urdialis, he had one more move left. One final act that would leave everyone stunned. Because before the families could even process the verdict, before California could set an execution date, before Illinois could even begin his life sentence, Andrew Urdialis took matters into his own hands. One morning, guards making their rounds at the prison found him, unmoving, cold, and suddenly, the families who had waited years for justice realized they might never get the ending they wanted. Because Andrew Urdialis, the man who confessed to killing 8 women, was dead by his own hand. But the story doesn't end there, because what he left behind, what investigators found in his cell that day, would raise questions that haunt this case to this very day. The news broke before dawn. Andrew Urdialis, the man who confessed to 8 murders, was gone by his own hand. The prison guards found him hanging in his cell, just hours after another legal hearing had confirmed his sentence. The families were furious. Some were in shock. Others cried as they realized they'd never see him take his final breath in the execution chamber. Justice, they felt, had been stolen from them. But as the days passed, it became clear this was not the end of the story. Not even close. Because in that cell, Andrew Urdialis had left something behind. A small, battered notebook. And inside were pages that changed everything. Detectives opened it carefully. Page after page. Dates, times, names. Some they recognized. The victims they already knew about. But then, there were others. Names they had never seen before. And suddenly, the question that haunted everyone was this. Had Andrew Urdialis killed more women than anyone realized? The FBI got involved. Cold case detectives from multiple states pored over the notebook. Every word, every scrawled map, every cryptic message he left behind. And then came the bombshell. One of the names in the notebook matched a missing person case from years earlier. A woman who had vanished before anyone knew the name Andrew Urdialis. Her case had gone cold. Her family had no answers. And now, this notebook suggested she had been one of his first victims. Long before police had ever linked him to anything. The power shift was immediate. What had seemed like the end of the story was suddenly the beginning of something even bigger. Because now, it wasn't just about justice for 8 women. It was about uncovering the full extent of Andrew Urdialis's crimes. And here's where it got darker. Journalists began digging. Former acquaintances came forward. And what they revealed sent shivers through everyone following the case. Andrew Urdialis, they said, used to brag in disturbing ways. Little comments at bars. Offhand remarks to coworkers. People thought he was joking. But now, looking back, they realized he might have been confessing all along. One man told reporters, "I remember him talking about women like they were nothing, like he could do whatever he wanted. I didn't take him seriously back then. I wish I had." Another former neighbor recalled hearing noises in his garage late at night. She thought he was working on his car. Now, she wondered if it was something far worse. The notebook also hinted at locations. Remote places. Places police had never searched. And so, detectives started organizing teams. Cadaver dogs. Ground-penetrating radar. Dig sites in the middle of nowhere. Weeks turned into months. Each search brought painful anticipation. Would they find another victim? Would another family finally get answers after decades of silence? One search site in particular, an abandoned stretch of desert in California, became the center of everything. Because Andrew had drawn a map in his notebook, with an X marked right there. And when investigators arrived, they did find something. Human remains. The coroner later confirmed they belonged to a woman who had been missing for over 20 years. A woman no one had connected to Andrew Urdialis. Until now, the media went wild. Headlines called him one of the most prolific and overlooked serial killers in American history. Families of other missing women demanded answers. Cold case detectives from across the country flooded tip lines with new leads. And here's where the power shift hit hardest. The families of his known victims, the ones who thought justice had finally been served, now realized the true scope of what he'd done might never be known. Because the only man who had all the answers was dead. Some families felt robbed all over again. Others felt haunted, wondering if there were more names, more sites, more victims buried in places no one had thought to look. And as investigators kept uncovering clues from that notebook, a disturbing theory began to emerge. Had Andrew Urdialis been working alone, or was someone else involved? One entry in particular caught everyone's attention. It mentioned a partner, someone who helped him once. Detectives didn't know if this was real, or some twisted fantasy he wrote before taking his own life. But if it was real, that meant someone else out there knew what happened to these missing women, and might still be walking free. The investigation widened. Detectives followed the clues across state lines. They interviewed old friends, former cellmates, anyone who might have heard Andrew talk before his death. And then, one name came up. A man who had known Andrew decades earlier. A man whose past was about to blow this entire case wide open. Because what police found when they knocked on his door would change everything. Police cars rolled through the quiet Illinois neighborhood. It was just after dawn, when detectives knocked on the door of the man who once called himself Andrew Urdialis's friend. A man whose name had appeared in that haunting notebook. First, he denied everything. Said Andrew exaggerated. Said the so-called partnership was a joke. But detectives weren't buying it. Because when they searched his home, they found something chilling. A box, buried deep in his garage. Inside, old photos, IDs, and a piece of jewelry belonging to one of Andrew's unconfirmed victims. The man had no explanation. He stammered, he sweated, and finally he confessed. But not to murder. At least, not directly. He admitted he helped Andrew once. Helped lure a woman under false pretenses. Claimed he left before anything happened. Detectives didn't know whether to believe him, but what he said next sent shivers through the entire task force. "There are more," he whispered. Those words cracked the case open again. Because if there were more victims, where were they? Who were they? And how long had law enforcement been chasing only half the story? For weeks, police interrogated him. They scoured records. They cross-checked every missing persons case in Illinois and California from the 1980s and 1990s. And slowly, a fuller, darker picture began to emerge. Andrew Urdialis had always worked alone when it came to the killings. But he hadn't always worked alone when it came to the setup. Sometimes, he had help gaining access to his victims. Someone to give him an alibi. Someone to make a terrified woman feel safe before the nightmare began. That man, the so-called friend, became the key to unlocking several cold cases once thought unrelated. One by one, more victims were identified. Families were contacted. Funerals long since held finally had answers attached to them. And while the man insisted he never killed anyone himself, he was charged with multiple counts of conspiracy, obstruction, and being an accessory after the fact. For many families, it wasn't enough, but it was something, because through him, they learned the truth about what happened to their daughters. Even if the monster who killed them was already gone. The trials dragged on for months. Witnesses took the stand. Experts analyzed the notebook. The surviving victim, the one who escaped Andrew years ago, testified again. Her words shook the courtroom. She spoke about the fear, the manipulation, the moment she realized she might never see daylight again. But she also spoke about survival, about how she fought to live, about how she wanted justice not just for herself, but for every woman who didn't make it out alive. When the verdict finally came, the former friend of Andrew Urdialis was convicted, sentenced to decades in prison. It didn't bring the murdered women back. but it brought the families something they had waited for so long, the truth. And as investigators closed the files, one thing became painfully clear. Andrew Urdialis had been far more dangerous, far more cunning than anyone ever realized. For nearly 2 decades, he'd moved between states, between lives, between identities, killing without leaving a trace. The fact that he confessed at all was nothing short of a miracle, because without that confession, some of his victims might still be listed as missing persons today. In the end, justice didn't come the way anyone expected. He was never executed by the state, never sat through every family's impact statement, never heard the final words of the people whose lives he shattered. But the truth, his full list of crimes, his entire legacy of evil, came crashing into the light for everyone to see. And that was how justice finally found him. Even in death, this case left behind a lesson burned into the minds of detectives, journalists, and families alike. Monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes, they look like the quiet neighbor, the guy at the bar, the man no one ever suspects. But eventually, no matter how long it takes, the truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface. And for the families of Andrew Urdialis's victims, that truth, as painful as it was, brought the justice they had been denied for far too long. As the final gavel fell, the lead detective on the case said quietly to reporters, "Justice isn't always neat. It isn't always perfect. But today, it was done." And with that, the story of Andrew Urdialis finally came to an end. But the memory of his victims and the fight to uncover the full truth will never be forgotten. Like, follow, comment, and subscribe for more true crime stories, because sometimes the darkest cases hide in plain sight.